Hi, I'm Susan Bauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press. And we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings. And today we're going to try something fun. We put out a call for homeschool fails on social media, and you all delivered. Thank you so much to everyone who shared your story with us on our Instagram and our Facebook via email. We definitely laughed out loud multiple times as we were going through these. And we received more responses than we could possibly include on this episode, but we're going to share some of our favorites with you and try to give some helpful commentary and notes and responses to your hilarious stories.
And then you will all feel that you are not alone. So,
right. That's the goal here.
But you know what, Susanna, before we do that, I think you should tell our listeners a little bit about the weekend that you just had.
Oh my goodness. Yes. So depending on when you're listening to this, hopefully this is still relevant. I think we as a country are going to be dealing with this for a long time. I was supposed to go on my first relaxing vacation with my husband, my husband's folks, and our baby.
New baby, first baby trip.
Yes, first baby trip. And like I think many new mothers probably do, I overpacked and did not regret it because we went to, of all places, Asheville, North Carolina.
Oh
and depending on when you're listening to this, I'm sure you all have probably heard about Hurricane Helene, which ravaged Asheville, North Carolina, where we were. We were in a small town called Marshall, which I think pretty much isn't anything anymore. The whole main strip of the town was flooded. The pictures were really, really scary. We were totally safe. We were up on a mountain and we just lost power, lost cell service. But it was scary to be. I don't think I've ever been in a position in my life where there were multiple days without power and cell service, just feeling so disconnected to the world. Like we didn't know how big the storm was, how far reaching it went. The only news we had was the radio in our car.
Yeah.
So that was a very harrowing first trip with the baby, but we're thankful to be home and just cannot stop thinking about the folks in Western North Carolina right now who are going to be dealing with this for a very long time.
For a very long time. And we're so glad you're back. You finally, I think, managed to get through to us on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Which I think was the only thing you could connect to.
Yeah. For whatever reason, WhatsApp worked before my texting worked. So I got a message out that way and could not wait to tell my mom that we were alive because I think she probably had a harder time than we did, just being able to reach us for multiple days.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was not actually meant to be a plug for WhatsApp necessarily, but I would like to put in a plug now, which is that I personally have donated to World Central Kitchen, which there's so many charities out there and there's so many ways that you can help. But I really love that World Central Kitchen goes in and takes care of one of the most basic needs that people have, which is if you don't have food, nothing else is going to go well. So I challenge our listeners, if you're feeling like you'd like to help out with the crisis, which, as Susanna says, is going to be going on for quite a long time.
Yeah.
You might consider donating to World Central Kitchen. We'll put a link in the show notes.
We can put a link in the show notes. And I will say it was really heartwarming to see, even though we were just guests in this region, neighbors came in and checked on us. They said, if you're hungry, we'll bring you deer meat. People were just so kind. Someone came through with a chainsaw to help with the cleanup, just neighbors helping neighbors. And as we were driving out of town, I wish I had gotten a picture of it, but we were driving and I didn't. There was a little tiny house in the middle of a gap in the mountains, just a little house with a little porch. And they had taken a big piece of wood and had spray painted onto it, "We have internet," and just put it in front of their mailbox so that anybody driving by, if they didn't have a way to contact their loved ones, could stop at their home and send out a message. I thought that was just, it gave me the tingles when I saw that.
Oh, there's good in the world.
Isn't there? Yeah.
Okay. And there is so much good in homeschooling families, even when they trip up a tiny bit.
Right.
So let's go into discussing these homeschool fails that have been shared with us. I'll actually start, if you don't mind. This is something that I've referred to in a previous episode, and I wanted to come back to it just because it wasn't a parenting fail. It was specifically a homeschool fail. And that is that my youngest daughter mother, we decided that when her older brother, the last of her three brothers at home, went away to college, that it would be good for her to go to the Montessori middle school nearby rather than being the only homeschooler all by herself at home. So, and that was a really good experience. She went there for 3 years and then she came back home for high school because that was also the right thing to do at the time. But when I got her all registered for school, which was my first time ever, by the way, my first day of school was with her when I took her to the Montessori middle school, I realized that I had no idea where her shot records were. And I am not anti-vax. She had all of her shots. She was totally up to date, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Her pediatrician had retired and they didn't have any of the records.
Oh, no.
Some of the shots she had gotten at our local community health center, they didn't have any records. And I swore to the school up one side and down the other, yes, she'd had all the shots. But you know what? Because we're homeschoolers, I had never had to produce them before. Nobody had ever asked me for the records. And finally, I will ask for her permission to share this photo. If she says yes, we'll put it in our show notes. Finally, the doctor that she was going to said, look, hon, there's no way around it. If you want to go to school, we're just going to have to give you all the boosters again. So,
wow.
And Emily, she's 12. So she was like, okay. She was so scared. And so I turned around and parading into the room were 6 nurses and each nurse had a shot and in their hand. And the doctor said to her, we have found, so I'm not the only person that did this clearly. Right. We have found that in this kind of a situation, it's easier if we just do it all at once. So she stretched out both of her arms and the doctor went 1, 2, 3. And the nurses gave her all 6 shots simultaneously. And then we went out for ice cream.
Oh, at least you got ice cream.
I know, we got ice cream, but I felt so bad that I had done this to her because I didn't have the records. And I was homeschooling. I had 4 kids. I had a job. I still don't know what happened to those shot records. But yeah, that was pretty much a straight result of the fact that we were homeschoolers and nobody had asked me for them.
Well, I do not think you're alone in that. I know that I had to get a bunch of shots that I had already had when I started college.
Oh, did you? Oh,
yeah.
That makes me feel a little bit better, Susanna.
So you're not alone in that. But we got so many awesome fails from you all. So we're going to get started sharing. I think some of these fails speak to bigger principles. Like you were saying, sometimes as a homeschool parent, there's paperwork that you just don't need to produce for anything until a very, very long time. So it's easy not to keep track of it. So we're going to try to offer some helpful commentary as we go. We have divided our fails into 5 categories just to kind of give some semblance of an organizing strategy for this episode. And our first category is things you should know.
Missing
links is our other name for that category. And we're going to start with a story from actually Tammy, who is from Well-Trained Mind Press. And she shares this story about her 7-year-old child. So my child was 7 and we were at the soccer field for the first day of the new season. The kids are gathered around the coach on the field. I'm off the side with the moms when my child yells out across the field loudly, "Hey mom, how do we spell our last name?" Our last name only has 5 letters. I realized in that very public moment that I had neglected to teach them to write their full name.
Oh my goodness. And this happens so often because, when you're homeschooling, your kid doesn't write their name on their paper every day. Why would you bother? There's a variation on this one. And I had this same experience that our listener Tracy sent in. She said, I dutifully taught my oldest son how to write in cursive when he was in 3rd grade, but used it very little after that. When we went to open his first checking account, the bank teller wanted him to write his name, and he said he left something in the car and came back out and asked me to come help him find it. We excused ourselves, and he informed me he couldn't remember how to write his name in cursive. So we had a quick lesson in the parking lot so he could finish getting his first checking account.
I would say that's a very smooth kid.
I know. That's a really great presence of mind there.
Right.
I empathize with this one. We did it before we got to the bank, but I realized when I took my oldest to get his first checking account that he had no idea how to sign his name. He just printed it.
Right.
And then this happened. You'd think that I would have learned, but then my second son, we took him abroad for the first time. And when we got to the passport check, the agent looked at it and said, "Son, you didn't sign your passport." And he turned around and gave me this deer in the headline looks. And finally, he sort of straggly printed his name in the passport, and the agent let it go. But I thought, oh, I have failed.
Well, I think this speaks to, and what this category of missing links sort of covers, are that as homeschool parents, there's so much that we have to cover. Everything from tying your shoes to the anatomy of a plant. Like we're covering so much. And so sometimes little things like this that seem so inevitable just get missed.
And some of these things happen to us because of advancing technology. I think most kids now type pretty much everything. I don't know how long the value of a written signature is going to last, but it's something that it's very, very easy to miss. And it's kind of like our next story from Anne Marie, who said, "I realized that my 8-year-old knew a significant amount of Latin, but couldn't tie his shoes."
The joys of a classical education.
Well, I mean, but you had to learn to tie your shoes when I was a little kid because everybody's shoes tied. But now there's so many different kinds of shoes. I think that would be a really easy one to miss.
Right. So we have another one in this category from Julia, who said, "My second grader at the time, now a smart 9th grade kid, spent a whole year thinking Pearl Harbor was a sweet old lady and always wondered why the Japanese were so mean to her. I didn't know until he was arguing about it with his older sister. Poor Miss Pearl."
Poor Miss Pearl. I don't know this person, but I'm guessing they're from the South, where there's a lot of Miss Pearls around.
It's easy for little things to get missed when you're homeschooling and your kids aren't interacting with kids from lots and lots of families every day.
I have to say, I really love this next one from Andra. She says, "We lived in a small community where my husband and I were pastors. The school decided my homeschooled kids could play on their middle school sports team. They went into the school for the school physical day. My daughter came back out and sat with me on the bleachers and asked, 'Mom, what's a joint?' I thought, oh no, I failed as a mom. I haven't taught my kids about drugs." So I proceeded in front of God and quite a few parents to explain what a joint was and how to roll one. That's going the extra. That's going the extra mile. "No, Mom," the daughter says, "I'm talking about a knee or an ankle. Is that a joint?" Mom says, "I wanted to hide." She's now 26 years old, and I have yet to convince her that I have never rolled a joint nor smoked one. I've just seen it done on TV.
That is too funny. When you're trying to correct something in the moment publicly and it does not go as planned.
Well, this again speaks to that pressure that we feel to make sure that our kids have all the knowledge they need, because there is a lot of information that we don't necessarily give to our kids because we are protecting them. Things that they would have learned earlier if they had been in a classroom just out of necessity. But there's an argument to be made for waiting to introduce that kind of information to children. And, I think I wouldn't have explained to my kids what a joint was.
Right.
In fact, I don't think I ever have. I think they figured that out when they got to college, probably. That does remind me actually of the time when I was taking my daughter for ice cream, and she was a little bit younger. She was probably 7 or 8. But we were sitting there eating ice cream, and I actually had my mother with me. We were all sitting there together eating ice cream, and she turns around, looks at me, and she says, "Mom, what's a prostitute?"
Oh no.
We're in the middle of Colonial Williamsburg. Lots of people wandering around. My mother listening to my answer.
Talk about pressure.
I know. And I thought, okay, well, we haven't had the talk yet. So how do I explain this in a way that doesn't get inappropriate for her age? And I sort of just like stumbled around and I hemmed and I hawed and I finally said, well, there are some men who can't have a meaningful relationship with a woman, getting a little in there, a little soapboxing.
Right.
And so because they can't get women to be friends with them, they pay the women to be friends with them. And I could see my daughter thinking, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. And I thought, oh, I don't want to get into this. And so I just said, which is bad. It's very, very bad.
Well, maybe there's a certain age at which we sort of make moral judgments for our children, and then at a later time they get all the information.
Indeed. Well, if there are things that you discovered your kids didn't know, I have a wonderful friend who lives in California who homeschooled her 5. And I know when we were both in the thick of things with, tons of kids in school, I remember her telling me once, so my new principle is when we go to the pediatrician and they ask the kid what grade he's in and he turns around and stares at me like he's never heard it before, I'm like, nope, kid, you're on your own. I'm not answering this question anymore.
I think it's a very common one for homeschoolers, which is actually not a bad thing. It means that kids aren't being held to this very an artificial standard that we have in schools that homeschool kids aren't used to, which brings us to our next category, which is never test a homeschooler. Some funny stories where homeschoolers were introduced to standardized testing. And our first one comes from Amber, who said, my homeschooler missed a standardized test question because he didn't know the definition of the word tardy.
Oh, I love that so much because where else do you ever hear that word except in the context of a classroom?
Right. So in this particular story, you have 2 artificial standards, the test question, which assumed a child would know that word. And then also the fact that a homeschool kid wouldn't have to really be tardy or be somewhere at a certain time, which is another thing that is sort of public school kids or schooled kids are more used to. And I think this is a great teaser for a coming episode we're doing about standardized testing in general. We'll have a lot more thoughts and hot takes on standardized testing, but it is really important to recognize there's a lot of interesting research about how reading comprehension and in many cases test results based on reading comprehension measure stuff that your kid knows. And so if your kid isn't familiar with the school setting, words like tardy and many other school related words won't make sense to them. And so that could impact their testing scores, even when they're really totally fine with their reading comprehension in general.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of research done too to show that particularly older versions of the SAT and the ACT, these standardized tests, really disadvantaged kids who were from poorer backgrounds or from inner city backgrounds because they would have these reading passages about being on a yacht. Experiences that not only have the kids not had the opportunity to have, but the vocabulary connected with them is so esoteric and specialized.
Right. And we can put a link in the show notes to some of those studies because it's really fascinating. And it also sort of is a argument for the idea of a knowledge-rich elementary curriculum, because if you think about knowledge as a sort of source from which the more a child knows about a topic, the easier it is for them to read about it, right? Yeah. So their reading comprehension is going to be higher if they have familiarity with that topic already. So if we can provide our children with just a knowledge-rich, just soaking in information about all these interesting parts of science and history, it's going to improve their reading and their ability to learn new things, and they're not being intimidated by reading as they grow and become adult learners.
And you can get tripped up by things that seem so ordinary to kids who have been in a classroom, which is Marilee sent us a story and said that my 3rd homeschool grad called me from college asking if I had ever taken a test where, quote, the answers had to be filled out in a paper with a bunch of circles. She had to ask the student sitting next to her how to use it. Now, I think doing those Scantron tests is something that most students probably have had to do at some point. But the truth is that the closer you cleave to a sort of word-rich classical curriculum, the less likely you are to come across one of these.
That's true. And this speaks to or is another teaser for our standardized testing episode. But when your students do encounter a standardized test, they may have no prior experience, and then they're learning it in the moment. And that's sort of setting them back from the actual information that they're being tested on. So it's just a quick plug to introduce your kid to these testing types before you send them out to take the SAT or go to college or take a standardized test, because they can be a little intimidating if you've never seen a Scantron. It's a little scary looking at first.
Yep. And you got to match it up with the booklet. And so, so be sure to tune into our standardized testing episode so we can tell you how to avoid that. But it happens to a lot of kids.
Right. And then our last fail from this category comes from Stephanie, and she had a really creative child with some amazing answers to their standardized test. She said that her kid was assessed by by a teacher per government requirements. He was 7, and the teacher told her that the teacher was in tears and laughter as she was grading this test. So here are a few of the test answers from the 7-year-old. Question: name things you would put in a school bag. Answer: a school, obviously. It's a school bag.
It's a school bag, which this kid has probably never put his books in a bag in his life. So.
Right. Then we have a question from the math portion of the test.
Okay, so this was supposed to be math.
Right. This is from the math portion. Describe a pyramid. The answer. This was a long answer that the student gave involving a couple of mean pharaohs and some physics laws. So I think he went above and beyond here.
Indeed.
And then this mother's personal favorite was on the answer sheet beside name, where the student was supposed to put his name. He wrote name, a word that can be common, like a cat, or proper, like fluffy.
That kid has been doing first language lessons.
I think we might be able to guess that. I just love that. So this student was overzealous and turned the name into an actual grammar question, which is so hilarious, but clearly didn't have to write his name on all his homework growing up.
We'll be back after this.
Are you looking for an open and go, no-nonsense approach to teaching reading? Our program, The Ordinary Parent's Guide to Teaching Reading, isn't fancy or expensive, gimmicky or complex. It is affordable, straightforward, and efficient. We believe that a strong, confident foundation in reading is one of the best gifts we can give our children. So our program makes teaching phonics doable for every parent. Scripted open and go lessons empower you to teach your child to read in just 10 to 20 minutes a day. The original Ordinary Parent's Guide to Teaching Reading helped 1 million parents teach their children to read. Now our revised edition takes the same time-tested principles and matches them with an easier-to-use design. Check out samples on our website, welltrainedmind.com, and use the code PODCAST at checkout for 15% off your purchase. Happy reading!
Well, let's talk a bit more about getting started. And I think, Susanna, you have called this next category false starts.
Yes. So moving on to our third category, false starts. We have a story from Jamie. She said, as a public school teacher of 8 years, when I first stayed home with my kids, I thought I would unschool. It was all over my feed.
Okay. I just want to stop you for a minute here. I'm going to talk about unschooling a little bit after you share this story. But that is not only a super, super common, but also sometimes really good decision to make when you first come right out of the classroom. So, okay, public school teacher, 8 years. She decided to unschool. Go for it.
Yep. It was all over her feed. It must be what I'm supposed to do. Come February of the first year, I nearly pulled all of my hair out and basically had an identity crisis. That's when a friend suggested the guidance of the Well-Trained Mind book. We now have a bit of structure, goals, and a lot less tears. I can't tell you how slow I was to change our reading curriculum to all about reading. It was terrible before the switch.
Oh, I'm sorry she had such a rough transition.
Yeah. So I think this story, it's a more serious story, but I think a lot of homeschoolers probably have this experience of getting really excited, getting started, and then something not working for their family. And I think what's great about this story is that when she realizes that, she pivoted, she got more information, she found something that worked.
And that is part of the process. That is I don't even like to call this a fail because it's really the only way to find your feet. The only way to figure out what you're supposed to be doing is to try an approach and see if it works for you and your family. It's just so important not to get stuck in this sort of, I'm going to do this, darn it. And if I just try harder, I can make it work. It's so important to have that flexibility to stop and say, actually, this isn't working. Let's try something completely different.
And I think it can be scary to do that in the middle of a school year. But if it's any comfort to parents, I worked in 2 different public schools, and we switched systems. We changed course. We adjusted things all the time mid-year, even in public school. Sometimes you just realize something's not worth it and you have to make the switch. And it's really okay to do that. It's happening everywhere education is happening.
And your kids will be okay. I mean, I think that there's just so much fear involved in we're going to keep using the word fail, even though I don't like it, because that's what it feels like, right?
Right.
So you've tried something, you've worked at it for 3 months or 6 months or even longer. And it's so hard to stop and say, this isn't working, because you think to yourself, I have wasted months of my child's life.
Yeah.
You have to listen to take it from me. I'm an older, wiser woman now. Nothing was wasted here. As long as you are willing to talk about what went wrong and adjust based on your conversation, your kid is still learning how to learn.
Right.
Those false starts can be an incredibly valuable part of the educational experience.
Right. Well, we have another story I'd love to hear your thoughts on from Talitha, who says, my homeschooling fail started right away. My 4-year-old son was a genius. At least that's what I thought, right?
Oh, everybody with an oldest child thinks that.
I'm right about my daughter. She's the smartest 6-month-old baby in the whole world.
Well, yes, you absolutely are.
No, we all think that about our kids, right? So he was so interested in learning his letters, counting and writing things down. He was clearly ready for formal schooling. I bought a kindergarten grade level package from a homeschooling company for my 4-year-old because he was advanced, remember? And we started some lessons. The first week or 2 went okay. We made it through our letters of the week and he seemed to be pretty excited about it. Then about the 3rd week in, it was time to work on the letter M. He did not want to write the letter M in his workbook. He would not write the letter M in his workbook. I used some creative reverse psychology parenting and said, that's okay. You take as long as you need to with the M's. I'll just go away, put some laundry away and check on you and see how it's going. So I came back a few minutes later and instead of his M's, he had written no, no, no for each blank where an M should go.
Pretty good writing for a 4-year-old.
Right. It was then that I realized I had started the formal homeschool process way too early. Instead, we spent that year without any workbooks at all. We read books, we made letter crafts, and spent lots of time outside. I definitely learned not to rush the process. That was 5 years ago. And yes, he did successfully learn how to write the letter M at some point.
Oh my goodness. Well, there's so many things I could say about this absolutely wonderful story. And Susanna, do we have a picture of this? If we do, we should.
Do. It's on our Facebook page. And I'm going to ask and see if we can get it somehow linked to our show notes so you can see these no.
Parents, listen to your children when they speak clearly to you.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy with a bright child, particularly if this is an oldest or only child, because you haven't done it yet and you've got more time than if you're homeschooling 5 simultaneously. It's so easy to feel this pressure to really push them forward, give them every opportunity is how it sounds. That's the better sounding way to put it.
Right.
Give them every opportunity, develop their skills. But so much of what is marketed to parents of young children really requires us to push kids past what they're able to do. And I mean, I love the fact that this kid was articulate enough to say no.
Right.
Because sometimes you just get tears
or
falling on the floor or, ripping paper or some form of a tantrum because they're really not quite articulate enough to just say no.
Right. And I actually was just speaking to a friend recently who was telling me how when she first started homeschooling, I believe her first grader, she was pressuring this first grader so hard to do first grade level work because she was so afraid that everything would go wrong if her first grader didn't do first grade level work. But when she finally pulled back and pulled some subjects back into kindergarten work, her student started to thrive. And now her student is, I think, in 2nd grade and doing fine and on grade level. But sometimes with these younger kids, whether it's starting too soon because they are so bright or starting too fast because they're just not ready yet, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be on grade level or to be pushed pushing them fast when they just need to go and play and make some letters out of construction paper and have fun, and they will get there when they get there.
Exactly. And you know what? Again, I don't even think this is a fail because this mom did exactly what she needed to do, which was she said, okay, no, we're not going to do that, and adjusted. I don't think any of these things are really quote unquote fails as long as we listen to them and try to move on from there. I know that if you haven't heard our episode about should homeschooling be regulated, which has proved to be a tiny bit controversial, but go have a listen and see what you think. One of the things that I said was I really thought that if you're homeschooling, that there ought to be some sort of official pediatrician visit every year, and that partly came out of my experience of having lost all my kids' shot records and having to then put her through an unpleasant experience because of my lack of record keeping. So if you can take what seems like a fail and flip it around and say, okay, let's think of this as a starting place. Where do we go from here? Then that's what homeschooling is really all about.
Absolutely. But another thing homeschooling is all about is getting messy. So
indeed.
We're moving to our next category, which is that got messy. And beyond just, because like you said, these really aren't fails. I wish we had a better word for it. Homeschool fail was sort of the easy nomenclature.
Well, I think everybody resonates with that.
Right.
Because that's what it feels like to you in the moment.
Right. Absolutely. But we wanted to take a moment to look at some more physical messes and frustrations, because so often, especially when you're homeschooling younger students, homeschooling is a messy process. And especially now with Instagram, it's so easy to compare your homeschool to the aesthetic Instagrammable pictures that you're seeing on social media. And sometimes, we spill worm guts all over the closet floor. We clog the drains. We make messes. And we're going to tell some of those stories now. And our first one comes from Meryl, who said, sensory bins with beans as the medium. Disaster. Beans everywhere, even with pretty controlled kids. We moved away from that house, but I imagine the new tenants still are finding beans to this day.
Oh my goodness, the perils of hands-on learning.
Right.
This reminds me a little bit. This isn't quite the same, but I remember when I had 4 children under the age of 10, trying to do math with the older 2 and keep the toddler occupied. And I had a baby who was just crawling around on the floor. And I remember that the only way we got through math lessons was that I used to roll Cheerios at the baby on the floor. And then she would sort of like chase them down because she was just crawling at the time and eat them off the floor. And okay, I guess that wasn't the most sanitary thing in the world, but it actually, got us through a lot of math lessons. I just remember my father, who was a pediatrician, actually coming upstairs one day when I was doing this. And I think I had just come back from a homeschool conference the week before. And he catches me rolling Cheerios at the baby on the floor. And he goes, well, I guess they don't ask you to do parenting seminars, do they? No. But man, we found Cheerios all over the place for years.
The Cheerios that would not go away.
Indeed. Well, this is a great story. This one from Churston. This was science. And science can get really messy when you're doing it in a homeschool. So she says, when my oldest was in 1st grade, we did a science thing where the kid layers oats, sand, and potting mix, and then adds worms to the top to watch and see how the worms mix soil. My daughter dutifully filled the jar, added the worms, screwed on the top, and I think she forgot to punch holes in the top. Oh dear. Regardless, she placed it in a dry and warm place, the closet. 2 days later, we were mid-math lesson when we heard a huge ruckus. The jar had exploded and the floor of our game closet was littered with glass, dirt, sand, oats, and worm guts.
Oh. I can just imagine.
What a cleanup.
But this science project became a new kind of science project, which is, why did it explode?
Yes, exactly. A learning opportunity.
Because that was the first thing that came to mind was, why did it explode?
A whole new investigation.
Right. And then our last that got messy entry. It comes from Alyssa, who said that we made piñatas for a study on Mexico, and instead of throwing the leftover paste in the trash, I washed it down the kitchen sink.
Oh dear.
All was well for several days. Then it seemed like our pipes were backing up and there was a clog. Husband does his best to try to clear them. Nothing happens. I call the septic company and it looks like we need to pump the tank anyway. The septic guys say there's definitely a clog and they work on clearing it. And then finally, after about 30 minutes, something pops out the pipe, a huge chunk of solid paper mache.
Oh dear. The piñatas that kept on giving.
Right. So if you're working with paper mache, note to everyone, do not flush it down the kitchen sink.
Listen, as somebody, I live in a house that's on a septic system, and the things that we don't wash down the sink, there's a whole list next to the sink.
Well, my husband's a plumber, and probably the same should apply whether or not you have a septic system. I think we put a lot more down the sink than they can generally handle, and you pay for it in the long term. I hear this all the time.
Okay.
My plumbing husband's soapboxes.
It's good to know. Well, Alyssa, I'm glad your septic guy got that out, and I bet you never washed paste down the sink again.
Again, another example of not a fail if we learn and move forward next time, doing things differently.
Well, we have a few just fun things to share
Yes.
now. I mean, things that these don't necessarily have any principle behind them. They just made us laugh.
Exactly. So we're calling this category unexpected turns. And like Susan said, we don't have a particular commentary, but we just had to share them. And our first one comes from Becky, who said it would be the time that she read about Joan of Arc and her daughters decided to try to tie her son to the stake and pretend to set it on fire.
I like the gender reversal there. This is very creative.
I laughed out loud when I read that one. So we just had to share it. I love it. I love the creativity. I love that fact that these girls were so excited about Joan of Arc that they tried to burn their brother at the stake.
Learning in action.
Right.
I loved Amy's story where her youngest daughter, she says, there was this year that my youngest daughter was doing a drawing tutorial for her language arts on shading. The instructor kept saying, make it darker. So she made the windows into gravestones. They all say RIP and asked the instructor if that was dark enough.
I don't know if she was being sassy or if she just really took the instructions a different direction, because I can see it going both ways.
It's pretty dark. This is pretty dark. There's a lot of RIPs on this. We'll see if we can put this one in the show notes as well.
Right. Our next one comes from Paula, who said, my kiddo read the sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon, the Headless Horseman, on Kindle and left a review afterwards on Amazon. Under my actual name, the review said, terrible book. Do not recommend.
Never give your kids your Amazon login. I think that's the real fail here.
Although it was a very succinct review.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I particularly liked, because I have had this sort of thing happen to me quite often. I liked this email from Lucy, who said, my son was about 6 and thoroughly enjoying the story of the world, especially the history of ancient Greece. One day we were in the pharmacy and I was picking up a prescription. Suddenly my son pointed to a display and shouted excitedly, Mom, look, the Trojans! He, of course, had no idea what the product was. He just knew the name. There are times when a homeschooling mom wants to proudly announce that her kids are studying ancient history. This, however, was not one of them.
Oh, that is too good.
Well, you know what? I love the fact that he was so excited about the Trojans.
Exactly. This was, again, another win. Another one of my favorites comes from Karen, who said that my favorite homeschool fail story involves my youngest son. We loosely followed the Well-Trained Mind homeschool schedule, so when he was 5, our family did a lot of read-alouds, including children's versions of the Iliad and Odyssey, Beowulf, and Greek myths. The kids loved it, and I was feeling like I was crushing homeschooling. During that year, I took my kids to our busy local library and tasked them with each finding a book themselves to bring home. My son hunted and grew more and more frustrated. I finally asked what was going on, and he turned to me and yelled, "There's just not enough killing in any of these books." We beat a hasty retreat from the library after that.
I feel like I should take some of the responsibility for that, because you know what? I have to say, particularly in the first editions of The Well-Trained Mind, when I was doing all the research, I had 3 boys.
Right.
And, you know, killing was where it was at.
Right.
So a lot of those recommendations reflect my all-male household.
Well, a lot of great literature has themes that are not necessarily child friendly, but when you introduce them in a child friendly way, kids love it.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Like those old fairy tales, like you would think these are kind of dark. Talk about dark. Grimm's fairy tales, they can be very dark, but I've seen that kids really resonate with that stuff for whatever reason.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you know what, Susanna, as we've gone through these, and these are fun stories, and it's good to know that, you're not the only person who forgot to teach their kid to sign their name or fill in a bubble, or lost their shot records. But, we've already said this, but let's say it again as we wrap up. Fails isn't quite the right word here.
Right.
These are creative kids who are having fun learning, and they are doing things that don't always work out. You as a family are doing so many other things that kids in a classroom don't do, that if you miss a few classroom things, which would you prefer? Would you prefer that they know how to, stand in line and fill out a Scantron, or that they're spending their days really learning what they enjoy?
Right. And I hope this episode encourages all of our homeschool parents who are working so hard to provide their kids with education that it's okay to mess up. It's okay to change directions. It's okay to miss something. It's okay to spill a science project. That's part of the messy process of learning. And sometimes those mistakes probably become some cherished memories for our kids and things we can tell them as they get older. And with that, that's probably all the fails that we can cover today. There are more on our Facebook page and on our Instagram page. So if you want to check out more and see some of the pictures, I would encourage you to look at the Well-Trained Mind Press Facebook page. So thank you everyone who sent in fails. We really enjoyed reading them, and I wish we could share even more. Thank you for listening to the Well-Trained Mind podcast. You can find Susan at facebook.com/susan.wise.bauer and Susanna on Instagram at hopintohomeschool. Our engineering and mixing is done by AJ Falari at ajfalari.online. This podcast is produced by Well-Trained Mind Press, and our supervising producer is Chris Bauer. If you enjoyed the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have questions, responses, or ideas for future episodes, email us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We'll be back next week, so stay tuned.